So we have a whole family that is in crisis. Mom's a schizophrenic, she's been institutionalized. The baby has just died, and the 13-year-old is about to have a baby, right? So the dad's just like, peace out, I can't even. Like, what? So, you know, not a warm and fuzzy tale. Hello, how are you? Welcome to another episode of our Worthy Review. My name is Cheer Denise, and if you're new to this channel, I review biographies and memoirs. So far this year, we've done Spare, we've done by Prince Harry, we did Revenge about Meghan Markle. We're doing a book called Traitor King about Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson and his abdication on the throne. That's still happening on Sundays. But added to that, during the week, we will be doing reviews of Jada Pinkett Smith's book, Worthy. And as I said last episode when I did the prologue for the book, I had not anticipated so much verbal garbage. I think one of the things that's a little bit frustrating for me so far about Jada Pinkett Smith is that I feel like she's just behind the current conversation. I feel like she still wants to keep having conversations that were probably, you know, burgeoning and interesting, say like circa 2001, you know. But I don't feel like anybody still wants to talk about, you know, being a goddess, being a queen, all of this. And I feel like in the same way that Meghan Markle keeps wanting to talk about how women are, you know, we have to find our way in the world, we have to get our step. It's like, but Meghan, you're so behind on the feminist conversation, you know? And so I feel like both people are a little bit behind on what the cultural moment is asking for and like what we want to hear. Even the fact that she wants to talk about her ayahuasca journey feels like a little late to the party. It's like we've already known though that that's like the trendy thing that celebrities are doing to exorcise the demons. So for her to now want to like jump in and be like, yeah, but me too, I also had an ayahuasca journey. It's just like, okay, but it just always feels a little bit too late. Anyway, the prologue was a whole bunch of crazy. It kind of reminded me of the prologue in Spare. But what I found with a lot of these celebrity biographies is that whenever they try to sound really meaningful, it just sounds like very sophomoric, very creative writing, you know, angsty, high schooler kind of offerings. And like because a high schooler, you know, generally doesn't have very many life experiences, or even if they haven't learned how to verbalize it in a meaningful and beautiful way. They just sort of throw a lot of emotive language and sort of ethereal kinds of statements to sort of stand in for meaning. And that's what I found with Jada Pinkett Smith's book. It said a lot of things, it was a lot of words, but it didn't really make a lot of sense in the prologue. So I really thought, and I had quite a few people commenting saying, I'm out, it doesn't make any sense. I don't think Jada Pinkett Smith has anything to say that I want to hear. And I think generally I would agree. I don't think Jada Pinkett Smith usually has much to say. Because it always feels like so much manipulation. I still want to read the books. Prince Harry didn't have anything to say either, and that was hilarious. But I think that the prologue was a lot of crazy. This next chapter we're going to read is the history of her childhood and who she feels like informed her the most in her early adolescent years. It's much more of a narrative. It's a lot less trying to inspire us, which I think I would much rather hear. I'd rather just hear her tell her story than, you know, constantly have her trying to make me feel a certain way by using a lot of emotive language and a lot of superlatives and all of this. I don't need that. Just like, so what's the deal? What's your deal? Like, why are you the way that you are? This whole chapter we're reading today is called My Grandmother's Garden. So it's chapter 1 of the book. It's a little bit disjointed in the sense that she starts out one place, talking about how she was a troubled adolescent in a lot of respects. And then she pauses that story and goes back to talking about her grandmother. And then the rest of the chapter is talking about her grandmother, what she experienced living in her grandmother's home as a young child, her grandmother's history. Grandmother sounds like a very interesting person. And then we but we never circle back around to talking about her angsty early teenage years. So I'm not sure when we're going to come back to that. Probably in the next chapter when we talk about her parents and how they are two addicts. I'm looking forward to that personally. But this chapter is a lot more subdued, almost to the point of being boring in some respects. I do think it's interesting that to find out what sort of people she came from. I don't think I am mistaken when I say she came from quite an affluent background, particularly from her grandparents' side. Now, I don't know so much about her actual mother and her father when we'll get into it, but her grandmother and her grandfather were definitely connected to I would say, the civil rights elite. And I would say that they were certainly running in the same circles as Martin Luther King Jr., and they had both made quite a life for themselves. They're both academics, and they lived in a very nice neighborhood, and they were able to give her a great upbringing in a lot of respects, lots of opportunity. So I think maybe at the beginning of this chapter, maybe she's trying to juxtapose what she had with kind of risking it in neighborhoods that were like a little bit more, to use her word, tricky. I don't know if she was like trying to slum it, or like, I don't know exactly what her deal was in this beginning of the chapter, but we're going to get a picture of her and her behavior when she was like 13, and then we're going to back way up and talk about her relationship with her grandparents and how she found herself living with them. Okay, so she starts this chapter out by saying, "It's close to midnight in the warm summer darkness, and I feel wild and free. I'm doing something I have no business doing, and I'm loving it. Living on the edge is already a habit, and in the years to come will be an addiction. I've just slipped out the kitchen's back door to an alley behind our modest row house on Prince Avenue. I press myself up and over the old metal gate, and I land on my feet like a cat. These are the moments when my dance and gymnastic classes come in handy. I charge down the alley, turning a sharp left to head south, then east, then north, in a kind of horseshoe direction. I'm 13 going on 14, and I'm on a mission to see my 16-year-old boyfriend who works the overnight shift at the 7-Eleven. So apparently she is alone in the evenings. She writes later in the chapter, she says, "My mother, Adrienne, newly separated from my stepfather, is an RN in a hospital maternity ward and has recently begun working the graveyard shift from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. She's like most single moms who work hard to keep the lights on and the food on the table, who can only hope and pray that they put enough fear in their children to adhere to the laws they lay down about how to behave when they aren't present." Well, she's decided that since her mom's, going to be none the wiser, she'll just continue to make a habit of going to see the 16-year-old boyfriend. She writes that she was dressed in jeans, a t-shirt, and sneakers. She says, "I'm tomboy cute right now. I have my hair pulled back into a sleek pony knot with the edges slicked down by Pro-Style gel. And because of the humidity, I probably hit him with a Tancho stick as well. I gotta be cute, but not stupid." What she means by that, and she goes on to say, is that she'd realized that navigating some of these rougher neighborhoods from her house over to the 7-Eleven, she was often going to run into some questionable characters who might take advantage of her if she looked too good. She describes one time 4 years earlier when she was 9, when this guy pulls up alongside her as she's walking down the road and asks her if she's seen a puppy. So she comes up to the window to like, "Wait, what are you talking about?" And there he is in all of his glory, just treating his body like an amusement park. And so she quickly backs up off of that, and the flasher sort of keeps an eye on her, and she runs across the street to the parking lot of the Jewish synagogue where she waits for him to peel out, and he eventually does. So definitely some sketchy situations, and from that she realized she needed to learn to carry herself with more masculine energy. She says, "Eventually I learned that if you don't look like easy prey, cowardly predators will move on. Part of staying safe was hiding my feminine nature and taking on a more masculine bravado in how I just carried myself. Even as a kid, I wasn't scared. I was disgusted, disrupted, but not scared. It was moments like these that taught me I had to be rugged and super vigilant. Not only that, but yeah, I learned early that there ain't no such thing as a safe neighborhood." Okay, first of all, two things. I really hate the fact that she had to experience that as a 9-year-old. That is horrific and just terrible, terrible, terrible that somebody would ride up on her like that and expose themselves. Unfortunate to the very extreme. But on a personal note, that is just completely petty, but I have to say it. I really, and this is me, this is not the law, but I don't like writing that is conversational, in the sense of, not only that, but yeah, I learned that there ain't no such thing as a safe neighborhood. Only just because I feel like if you're trying to present me with a book about your entire existence, like you don't need to dumb down your language in order to get me in on what you're saying. Ain't and yeah, it's just like, okay, whatever. But that's just me. That's totally and 100% a me thing. That's my pet peeve. That's not her fault. What I appreciate about, okay, so she continues on, that she liked the ghetto because in this particular hood, what you saw was what you got. She says, I appreciated the hood that I'm in tonight on my way to the 7-Eleven because there ain't no lies. It's not pretending to be something it's not. Safe. I know what it is. My instincts are dialed in and I've learned how to navigate this concrete jungle. I know how the various predators move and I'm dressed to move quick. Fight as hard as I have to, or retreat and hide. Now, when we go on to read about her upbringing, it's interesting that she would choose to put herself in situations where she needed to dress to fight and run from the killers and be prepared to hide. I'm wondering, and I believe the book will tell us, what is the connect, like where did she bridge this existence from the one that she comes up in? By anybody's estimation, the life I will describe to you at her grandmother's house is quite prestigious. And she's living in a house that is not on the edge of the ghetto. Oh, and she's living with her grandmother. And I'm just sort of surprised. I'm just wondering what has happened that has led her to be like seeking out these dangerous situations. And perhaps it's just because she did live where it was always safe and she wanted to see what skills do you have to have where it isn't quite as safe. Like maybe she just wanted to test her ability at survival. I don't know. She says that though her mom hoped that she was staying at home at night and had tried to put fear into her heart not to leave and had told her, hey, if you leave the house, bad things will happen. She was not the sort of child that was going to be, I guess, fear-mongered. And so she had gone ahead and just made it her business that from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., she ignored every law her mother had ever thought of. Can you imagine? This is like every parent's worst nightmare, that they would have to work the night shift and then their wayward child, like there's literally no one watching the wayward child. Later on, though, we're going to talk about the fact that when her mother would come home, she would never check to see if Jada was in the bed. And part of me feels like the reason she didn't do that is because she knew most likely Jada wasn't going to be in the bed, and she didn't want to have to deal with the reality of what was happening at home because she couldn't change it. Like, she's got to work. It's just very interesting. I'm really interested in the connection between when she left grandmother's house and this stage of life, because this chapter does not cover that. She says that she had started dating this guy named Mark, again, who worked at the 7-Eleven. That's why she's out at midnight to go hang out with Mark. She says that he was not her first boyfriend. She's 13, by the way. He's not her first boyfriend, but he is her most serious one. She says that he's fun and cute with a little smidge of quirk. She writes that he was black and Asian, Blasian, before it was even a term, tall and skinny. He has a wide, toothy grin and a deep voice that makes him sound much older than he looks. She goes on to describe that they had this sort of ritual where she would show up and then he would say, Jada, you shouldn't be here. And then she'd grin at him and be like, boy, yeah, you say that every time I come in here. And then he says, oh, you're crazy for doing this. And then they sort of settle down to eating chips and nachos and talking about their problems at home. And sometimes he would walk her home if his shift got off early. Sometimes he'd give her a ride home. On this particular night, he did not. They just hung out by the Slurpee machine and, traded talk. And then, right as it was beginning to dawn, it was time to roll. She says that the excitement I felt before is replaced by a sense of accomplishment mixed with melancholy that the night has ended. Now my focus is making it home before my mom does, because if she ever finds out where I've been, that's my ass, for real. She writes that, as is my drill, I slip back inside our row house, locking the door behind me, and fly up the steps to my bedroom. When my mother arrives home around 8 a.m., she doesn't come upstairs to check on me right away. Why would she? Her assumption, I'm sure, is that I'm safe and sound, fast asleep in bed, where I've no doubt been all night. But safe is just one of the many lies at this point in my life. All right, so she leaves us hanging on that one, because we don't know what happened. Why is she unsafe? Classic Jada Pinkett Smith. You know, put out this tantalizing bit of drama and then be like, but that's where my story ends. You know, it's like, okay, well, don't do that. Don't tantalize us with, but safe is just one of the many lies of my life at that point. Then she sets us into what she calls her origin story, which is just so much therapeutic language, I cannot. But she switches from what we really want to hear about, which is, why were you out at 7-Eleven with your 16-year-old boyfriend? Where was your mom? Or where were the adults? Or, I mean, we know where mom was, but like, what is happening? How has this become your reality? And she sets us back at grandmother's house, where her early raising had happened. Grandmother runs a tight ship, let me just say. But I really like grandmother on a lot of respects. Some of the things she does and says are a little bit like, well. But I can totally see that she was the sort of person who had a roadmap for life, who was trying to raise her children and her grandchildren with standards and, you know, holding everybody account and trying to make sure that people, you know, had an education and were elevated in their thinking and were kind to other people. I mean, she of course was not a perfect person. And we will vaguely touch on some of the more questionable elements of her child rearing philosophy. But I would say for the whole, Jada Pinkett Smith is really, really, really lucky that this was her grandmother. And I feel like she should have invested more time in learning grandmother's philosophy for life and less time in learning her mother's philosophy for life, because her mom sounds like a nut. Her grandmother seems like she had some logical sense, you know. All right. She wants to take us back. Her grandmother's name is Marion, and she refers to her grandmother as Marion. Obviously in the retelling of it, not in real life. And she says that when she thinks about her grandmother, she thinks about the garden that her grandmother kept and this huge backyard. And it does sound palatial, I must say. Her mother's name was Adrian, and her mother was the youngest of the 4 children born to Marion and her husband Gilbert. Now, her grandfather was a doctor, and he served at the head of anesthesiology at Provident Hospital, which catered to a predominantly Black community. Grandfather maintained a private practice as a GP, smoked a pipe, said little, and adored his wife. I was the firstborn grandchild. Because my mother and my father, Rob Sol Pinkett, were only married for just over a year, and Mom was only 17 when she became pregnant with me, we moved back into her parents' house when I was a toddler. And for all intents and purposes, that was home for much of my childhood. The house was nestled in a family-friendly, upper-middle-class neighborhood. She said that the house was directly across from a large apartment complex, almost entirely inhabited by members of the Hasidic Jewish community. And she said that their neighbors, in her words, definitely had their own flow. But living across the street from the Hasidic Jews taught her that she needed to honor other people's beliefs, that she should not take offense if they held themselves off in their own communities and didn't mix and mingle, because that's just the way that they had chosen to live life. She said she liked to watch the families out together on the street, coming and going, usually to and from the synagogue. In the process, I was taught to respect differences, that these differences didn't have to make us hate one another. She also says that it was important to my grandmother that I could find common ground with anyone, no matter what. The value of being well-rounded, as she called it, was at the heart of how she crafted my education and experiences. She was the center of my world, the center of well-being for each of her 4 children, their spouses and significant others, and my cousins. There was so much love in her house, as well as in her garden. The garden is going to be a theme this whole chapter. What I want to be really careful about in all of this reading is simply the fact that Jada Pinkett Smith is going to make a lot of statements that we can all agree upon. Nobody is going to say, oh, that's wild that your grandmother wanted you to be able to find common ground with anyone no matter what. Like, obviously, that's a value that everybody listening to this podcast would hope to be able to cultivate in themselves and in their children. But I feel like Jada Pinkett Smith does this thing where she names and claims characteristics that we would all agree on to create buy-in with her, so it's like no one's gonna throw up their hands and be like, well, that's outrageous, why would she say that? You're just gonna continually say things. And she did this in the prologue too. She'll say things like, now I believe that all women have dignity and value. Yeah, we all believe that. So she's saying things that are evident, almost unworthy of having, almost not even worth saying, because it's already an agreed upon decision. It'd be as stupid as if, no, I believe that you shouldn't kill people. Controversial, I know, but that's my personal belief. It's like, all right, well, we already know that. So I would say that nothing in this chapter is just wildly shocking, because it hasn't gotten shocking yet. She's just with her grandmother. And many of the stories going on through this chapter are a little bit dull, because I think in her effort to sort of sketch out what safety looks like monotony in a lot of ways. And also, if I can be 100% honest with you, the writing is not particularly articulate, so it's just not a joy to read because it's not beautiful writing. Let me give you an example. She says that grandmother always had them doing a lot of gardening jobs so that she could be part of the cycle of growth and know that she had made things possible by being a part of the chores with the garden. I think that's a nice life lesson. But then she goes on to say that one of her jobs was to rake the leaves. And, she goes on for a little bit about, how she would do it, and then asking grandmother's approval for how the job was done. And then she ends it with, the best part came next, leaping high into the air with my gymnastic skills, and then falling backward into the multicolored piles. The smell of the crunchy leaves stayed with me long after I'd come up for air and scrambled out. Do you see what I mean by just not excellent writing? It just feels a little bit elementary. And so I found myself having a little bit of a hard time caring throughout this part, but it did get more interesting when they started talking about grandmother's background. Now, grandmother was quite an interesting person, I must say. She apparently was West Indian and a Howard University graduate who went on to become a licensed social worker. Grandmother was a trailblazer, having been one of the pioneers in teaching of sex education in Baltimore schools. Marion had a refined, melodic way of speaking. There was no hint of her Jamaican heritage. She'd been born in Boston and had not lived with her immigrant family since she was 13 years old. Now, this chapter goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And it's not very linear in her description of being with her grandmother. And it's talking a little bit about what they did, and then it talks back about the grandmother, and then talks a little bit about what they did in the household and how they would clean toilets and stuff like that, because her grandmother was very meticulous, and then back to grandmother's heritage. For the sake of flow for this particular episode, I'm going to tell you all about grandmother, and then we'll talk about the house and how they lived life in the house. So grandmother had gotten pregnant when she was 13 years old. I'm shocked and astounded that she managed to make so much of her life having such a traumatic experience. Although it doesn't appear from anything grandmother ever said, and Jada Pinkett Smith backs this up, that grandmother was abused. It seems like she must have been in a relationship and didn't know what led to what. And that's how she became pregnant at 13. Anyway, to compound her very difficult existence, being pregnant at 13, her mother was schizophrenic and had been institutionalized by her father. At that point, the dad, who's already trying to juggle life with a schizophrenic wife, he finds out that his 13-year-old daughter in the 1920s is pregnant. He disowns her, and he doesn't want anything to do with her. Compounding that trauma is that a younger sibling had just died. So we have a whole family that is in crisis. Mom's a schizophrenic, she's been institutionalized. The baby has just died, and the 13-year-old is about to have a baby, right? So the dad's just like, peace out, I can't even. Like, what? So, not a warm and fuzzy tale, but he decides, I'm gonna put this daughter, she needs to go to foster care. I can't handle her. The daughter ends up, Marion, Jada Pinkett Smith's grandmother, ends up giving birth to her baby. She puts it up for adoption. It's a little baby boy. And then she ends up going to live with a white family in the foster care system. Although to me, it seems like indentured servitude because she ends up having to work as a maid in the house to earn her keep. So staggeringly unfair, it would seem. However, you have to believe that this white family who weirdly was making their, foster child be the maid also must have set her up on some kind of course for a decent education, because she finds herself at Howard University, where she becomes in touch with Howard Thurman and his wife Sue, and they help her get into this graduate degree program. And in the graduate degree program, she ends up going to India. She gets to be with the whole contingent of African Americans, this delegation of African Americans who had been invited to India with the express purpose of meeting Mahatma Gandhi. And Howard Thurman, who was a theologian, professor, and civil rights activist, was also a key influencer on the works of Martin Luther King Jr. And grandmother and Sandra were even present in 1963 for Dr. King's historic I Have a Dream speech in Washington. So grandmother was very well connected. And I am astounded by what she was able to accomplish with her in her life when she had such a traumatic childhood. And one of the things that grandmother was really big about was the fact that you need to instill hope in the next generation. You need to instill hope in children. You don't need to ever tell them that anything that has happened to them is going to keep them back. She absolutely was not a proponent of the victim storyline, that because something bad has happened to you, it's going to mark you forever. It's like, no, get up and look for the opportunities that you can. She was an incredibly hard worker. She was a self-made woman. She was a socialite in the community. She was a activist in the community. She didn't just say she believed things. She tried to show through her actions and through her work ethic and through the programs that she chose to volunteer at, that what she said with her mouth was what she did with her life. So I think she would have been a great role model for Jada Pinkett Smith. And I just feel like I'm not sure where the disconnect happened. Now, again, like I said, this lady is not a perfect person by any means. And we are going to talk about some of the things that she did and believed that I think were probably detrimental too. But I mean, I would say that she was probably a net positive for Jada Pinkett. That's grandmother's background. And we don't know a whole lot about grandfather, but he was doing pretty well for himself too as a doctor. And giving his whole family a great life. And he was an exceptional provider and loved his wife very, very much. He wasn't a big talker, but he certainly showed with his actions that he cared about his family. Now, back to the kind of lifestyle that was going on at the house, as long as they were living with grandmother. Now, Jada says the big part of day-to-day life revolved around what was going on in the garden. There was a flower garden, there was a vegetable garden. And so she says, looking back, I can see that my grandmother was in fact cultivating two gardens. One of them was the garden in her backyard. Her other garden was me. Grandmother poured everything she had into my cultivation, growth, and learning, just as I watched her pour everything into the soil of her garden, literally. Once, as we carried out the compost bucket, Marian egged on my curiosity. What do you think is in there? I smelled lemons? Lemon peels, yes. In that bucket, there was also fish heads, apple peels, coffee grounds, and whatever scraps had been collected in the kitchen. This was decades before composting became mainstream. See, we're getting the earth ready. The worms will come and till the soil for us. In a few days, we can plant seeds. My grandmother's garden was my school and my playground. All right, again, the writing, paltry. And just, no one's going to give you and your grandma credit for composting back then like it was some kind of extra special something, because people have been composting everywhere since the dawn of time. All right, so whatever. But it's just so dull. It's a little bit boring. She talks about cruising around the backyard in her big wheel. You guys, this was like the 1970s. For her to have a big wheel just shows that they had a little bit of cash. You know what I'm saying? And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. I just think that she's this whole thing that I know is coming, her trying to slum a bit, or to when I just know that once they move from grandmother's house and it's just her and her mom living the, single mom and daughter routine, and things are going to get a little more tight financially. She's going to lean way into that side of her story because that's the side of the story that makes her seem like she was victimized. That's the side of the story, like, I was so poor growing up. But it's like, your grandparents had opened their home. They were not poor, and I'm sure they didn't leave you starving in the street either. I'm just gonna have to move on past some of this stuff where she wants to talk about looking at a rose and considering how nature had created a boundary to protect its prize. It's like a lot of really dull analogies. She says the grandmother had a model work ethic and that she had turned even the most basic chores like weeding and cleaning up the bathroom as a personal challenge. She says that cleaning the toilet was a procedure, scrubbing and cleaning every inch of porcelain, including all the cracks around the base of the toilet. To which I say, yeah, I mean, I should hope so. That's exactly where you need to clean a toilet. I mean, of course, all the obvious places, but like, you better, if there's a man in your house, you better clean the base of the toilet, because I don't know what is going on in the bathroom. But what is up with the toilet, the sides of the toilet and the bottom of the toilet always being covered in urine? What are y'all doing in there? Anyway, she goes on and on and on about the kind of scrubbing grandmother expected her to do, and she had to really scrub those floorboards, and then her grandmother would put on a white glove and run her finger along the floorboards to see if it was really clean, and if it wasn't, do it again. But it doesn't seem like she was mean in any way. It just seems like she wanted to instill a work ethic, and that's very clear throughout the chapter. There's nothing dark or unkind about grandmother's desire to hold the standard. It's just, if we can do our best, let's do our best, which I'm 100% for. I was with grandma in all things until we got to this passage. She said that there was no spanking allowed in my grandmother's house, no tickling either, and we were not allowed to play hide and seek. These rules were not random. And when challenged, grandmother pointed out that spanking or beating children was reliving the horrors of slavery. Tickling had been used as a method of torturing prisoners of war in many cultures. And as for hide and seek, she simply didn't like it because, as she explained, I was once scared out of my mind when somebody who'd been hiding behind a door jumped out at me. That seems really weird. Okay, I can get behind the idea, like, let's not be spanking the kids, mostly because most people could never spank their child without letting anger infiltrate the experience. So I understand being like, let's just put the kibosh on spanking. But to say, I'm not going to spank you because I'm not going to relive the horrors of slavery, there's really no connection there. I think a better description of why you shouldn't spank is because I can't spank you without letting anger get involved as I lay hands on you. So I would never do that. That would be a better reasoning. It just seems a bit flimsy to say, I don't want to, call up the ghost of slavery. And this business about we don't tickle because in some cultures that's all about, we don't tickle because in some cultures that's how you torture someone. What is that? It just seems like grandmother had picked up some information at one point and then decided to utilize that in her, child rearing philosophies to seem, I don't know, well-informed about the world. Grandmother was well-informed about the world. She'd done a lot of traveling. It just seems like a really sort of punitive and an unimportant point. And it's fun to be tickled. It's like, was there really a deeper reason behind why she said that? Had somebody at some point been tickling her, but then taking advantage of that skin-to-skin contact? Do you know what I'm saying? And I also think this business about we can't play hide and seek because one time somebody jumped out at me. What is the context of that? Who jumped out at her? That's an insane statement to say we can't play because one time I got scared. That seems like there was something way more to that. So grandmother is making rules, and it kind of seems like when grandmother said a thing, there was no conversation around it. There doesn't really seem like there was a lot of, can you explain the whys behind that? I mean, she'd give you a reason, but that's not a reason to say we can't tickle because in some countries that's punishment for prisoners, and we can't play hide and seek because I don't want you to, I got scared one time. That's not really a real reason. Anyway, Jada confirms my belief by saying it was her house, her rules, and no one dared to defy her. She says that the one sad thing about grandmother was she was a terrible cook and she liked to create a lot of dishes that were disgusting and inedible. But if you didn't finish your food at that particular time, it would be served to you the next day and the day after that until you finally did get around to eating it. So it was best just to get on with it. She had been corrected one time at the table when she tasted something and said, "Ooh, this is nasty." And her grandmother said, "Oh, don't say that word. If you don't like it, you can say that it's unpleasant or distasteful." To which I say, thank you, grandmother, for elevating our vocabulary. But grandmother continued to be a little bit of a weirdo in the sense that she didn't feel that anybody should even comment on whether the food was enjoyable or not, because food is, quote, not meant to be enjoyed. It should be eaten for nourishment. This is a really sad way to look at food. I think food is one of the greatest things that God ever created, and I certainly will be enjoying my food, and it is simply not just for nourishment. I refuse to believe that. Sad, sad statement. Now, what's interesting to me is how much grandmother had involvement in just the total and full raising of this child. I don't know necessarily what the mother was doing. Now, considering the fact that Jada Pinkett Smith's mother had her when she was 17 years old, you can imagine that she didn't have a whole lot to pull from as far as being a great mother. So maybe she was just more than happy to let her mom take the reins on this one. And it would seem that, but for one instance we're about to read, the mom was like totally not in the picture. Grandmother was involved in signing her up for tap dance, piano lessons, tennis, gymnastics, whatever seemed enriching. Jada was involved with, and grandmother was seeking out and signing her up for it. She wanted Jada to be reading all the classic children's literature. She read Alice in Wonderland, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, The Learning Tree, Gulliver's Travels. And in the summertime, she was supposed to be reading because her grandmother said there's no such thing as taking a break from education. Here, here. And, one time her grandmother decided we're all going to learn how to do pottery. And, she signed herself up for her own pottery class as well as signing Jada up. So it was a family in a house that loved to learn and loved to have experiences. However, there was one time when Adrienne, the mother of Jada Pinkett Smith, decided to rise up and have her say. Jada writes, "My mother rarely interfered with grandmother's curriculum, except when I was in the first grade, and was shamed by a ballet teacher for being disruptive in class. To make her point, the teacher took me out of my pink tutu, put me in a black tutu, and stuck me in a corner facing the wall. When I told my mom about the incident, she saw red and confronted the teacher. My mother could not believe that the woman had the audacity to put the only black child in her class in a black tutu as a punishment. My mother had no qualms about making that point in the fierce Adrienne tone that, to this day, is a sign to get out of the way. To add more fuel to her fire, it turned out that back in junior high school, my mother was also put in a corner for being talkative. Upon hearing about it, Marion had immediately gone to the school. So not only was Adrienne irate at the level of humiliation I had suffered, but putting her foot down was in her DNA. Needless to say, that was the end of that ballet class." All right, let's have a little discussion, shall we, about this whole thing. Now, I think that it is of no actual worth to a student to publicly humiliate them into obedience. So the idea that you would change a child's tutu and set them in the corner for being disruptive is not really a great method in helping them to rejoin the class in a positive way. If you want to pull that child aside and have a conversation with them about what you expect, if you want to set some sort of other consequence, fine. But a child cannot just go into class and be talking over the teacher or being disruptive. I mean, something has to happen. So I'm not opposed to a teacher wanting to have some kind of a rule for that. As a teacher myself, you have to have boundaries that children know. When you come into my classroom, I expect you to behave in this way. And if you don't, there will be a consequence for it. But public humiliation, would never be an acceptable way to get a child on your side and get them in on your goals and dreams and aspirations for that class time. I understand Adrienne being frustrated, but I think that she is a little bit off in this idea that having the only black child in class be put in a black tutu as a punishment is some kind of extra specially racist thing, because I would not say that the child was put in a black tutu because she was black. I think she was put in a black tutu to show she had done something wrong, like a dunce cap. And any child who had done the wrong thing would have also worn the same tutu. I mean, that her being black and having the darker tutu put on her, I don't believe there was any correlation to that. Now, I do think that that is exceptionally heavy-handed, and I don't think that's an appropriate way to punish a child. But I think to bring race into it is an immediate problem, because I don't think it was race-driven. I think it was that child won't stop being disruptive, and so I've devised this plan to by shame, shape their personality and their characteristics. Not great, but also I don't think was a racist thing. I also think that this idea that you rush in when you hear something happen to your child and you want to go in and say, oh, to the teacher, you completely done the wrong thing. You shouldn't have done that. I don't think there's anything wrong with defending your child if you feel like they have been wronged in some way. But I also want to know, did anybody have a conversation with both Adrian and Jada about this is the way you conduct yourself in a classroom? Your teacher was wrong to punish you in that way, but you were also wrong to be a disruptive member of the class to such an extent that punishment was necessary, right? So I'm just wondering what conversations were had there, but whatever. We go on and on and on. She wants to give us a long description of a little Christmas play that she put on about the nativity scene with her cousins and whatnot. I mean, this is her way of letting us know that from an early age, she was all about the performance. I'm not impressed with some of the examples thus far that she is using to express her exceptionalism. I don't know. It just feels a little bit annoying, but I think it's probably born out of the fact that grandmother took every opportunity to say, Angel Pie, you are special. But I'm wondering, did grandmother tell her in what way she was specifically special? Because that is unhelpful to a child, to constantly tell them, you are so special. You are a star. You are number one. It's like, okay, but how am I a star? How am I number one? Tell me what you see in me. Tell me what my specific gifts and talents are. Because as a child, I can't really see that. But you as an adult can bless me and speak into me the things that you see that I'm good at. And then I will know what to cultivate. But it just, throw over that blanket of, you are a star, princess. It's like, okay. So then the child goes through life thinking there's nothing they could fail at because they're 100% awesome. And I really feel like that's where the narcissism began for Jada Pinkett Smith, by having adults constantly tell her, you go, girl, you win, win, win. There's nothing wrong with you. You're just nothing but, angel pie special. What's interesting is that Jada wanted more from her grandmother than what she was receiving with the angel pie, you're so special comments, because she writes, in remembering this period, I often ask myself, what was the thing she saw in me that made her say this? I'm not sure, but she said it enough that I believed her. Marion planted every possible seed at her disposal in order for me to become whatever I so chose. One thing that Jada did a lot was just watch her grandmother and watch how her grandmother conducted herself, and then decided to take her cues from that. One of the things her grandmother was really big on was activism and personal accountability. If she saw that something wasn't right in the world, she would personally decide to tackle that with her own actions. Example of that would be that she stopped buying Nestle products. Jada wanted some Nesquik for her milk at the grocery store one day, and her grandmother said, no, we don't buy Nestle products anymore because Nestle is trying to push their formula in Africa and trying to move mothers away from breastfeeding. The problem with that is that the water is not clean enough to mix with the formula, and the babies were dying. So because they were functioning on a moral deficit as a company, Marion would no longer purchase their products. Well, this idea that you could involve yourself in like global trauma by refusing to engage with a company that would be so morally bankrupt sort of enlivened Jada. She liked the idea that she could interject herself into the trauma of the world by making a moral stance against it. So she says that I knew immediately that this was the right thing to do, and that from that point on, this was one of my first lessons in activism. And she went through life looking for more of those times when she could feel like she was part of the conversation being had. This is my thing with activism. I feel like it is right and good to go through the world and be informed about what the various companies are doing so that you're not propping up quite frankly, your few dollars probably aren't going to make that big of a difference whether Nestle goes on or not, but you personally are drawing a line with, yeah, but I am not, through my actions, going to continue to help a company that is hurting other people. So I think that's all well and good. Like, you personally can do it. My issue with the activism is how often it becomes preachy and it becomes like a finger in people's faces. And if you don't do it, it's like, I think activism is important because you're informing yourself about who you are and what your values are. But I think that generally there's not, unless the whole country decides to turn against a certain company because of the objectionable actions of that company, probably won't do very much. So you have to just be okay with the fact that my actions are meant for me, not for necessarily global change. Otherwise, you just become a pariah, a social pariah, because everywhere you go, you're constantly trying to get everybody on your bandwagon. You have to do it because you think it's right, not because you make yourself feel better at night because you got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 friends to agree with you about this various thing. She says that one thing that they never really talked about in her home growing up was the experience of racism. Obviously, her parents, having grown up in a different time, would have experienced racism to a much more marked degree than Jada did, though she says her grandmother never discussed it. She was very optimistic about social change for Black people and always explained how we could support and uplift one another. Her belief was that a child's mind should be fed with hope so they would work for change as an adult, yet she felt just as strongly that it was essential to know your history. She says that she'd always had to go to bed at 8 p.m., but that changed in 1977 when the miniseries Roots came on, and then she was allowed to stay up and watch it. She said, for those 8 episodes, I sat at Marion's side and was spellbound. My reactions were complicated, fascinated, and confused all at once. That big black chain around Kunta Kinte's neck and what it looked like for people to be whipped until they bled were images that stayed with me. My grandmother found it important for me to participate in this historical event, the unprecedented major TV broadcast of a critical part of African American history, even if it was painful to watch. Let's just stop and discuss this. What do we think about this? I'm just wondering if it's necessary for a child to be shown those images. I think in another context, would the parents of a Jewish child sit them down when they're very young, like 8, 9 years old, and watch Schindler's List together, or something even more harrowing? I'm just wondering if it's good to put those images of people being whipped until they bled, people that look like you in a lot of ways. I wonder if that's a good thing to show a child that. I don't think you should shield a child from the truth of history, but I think telling a child the history and then showing them the history are two separate things. And I think that it's one thing to later on introduce them to potentially to that miniseries to say, we've talked about these things. This is the historical context. That when slaves would run away, they would be beaten mercilessly. And for a variety of other reasons, they'd be beaten mercilessly for nothing, and then later on, maybe in their teen years, to show them that. But I feel like to keep a child up at night to watch that miniseries, and she may be just feels like, if we don't watch it now, we'll never get a chance to see it again. For me as a parent, I would not have chosen to do that. I think I would probably have watched it and then told my children about it. But because I think that there's something really to be said for the filter of a parent, slowly exposing your children to some of some storylines that are deeper and more intricate and emotional and painful than that their little souls can handle at that point, but introducing them to the storyline, to the themes of that story. And then as they get older, you can introduce it to them in a deeper context, and then finally, the deepest context. But I would not have had my child watch that. My little child, I would not have let them watch people being beaten until they were bleeding. It seems strange to me. But that's what Marion chose to do. Marion, as a side note, she ascribed a lot more to the Dr. King's Combat Hate with Love movement. That was where she was functioning from with the civil rights movement. Her daughter, Adrienne, and her other daughter, Karen, came of age throwing black fists in the air. Both of them were taking a stand against injustice. Jada was watching them and watching their reactions to how they experienced being Black in America. Now, so we're going to segue from the way she dealt with racism to the way she dealt with religion. And this is where I don't agree with grandmother. None of y'all will be surprised. Marion called herself an atheist, but her mission was to expose me to all religions and philosophies so I could find meaning for myself. I find that to be an incongruent statement. How could you be an atheist, but then say, I want to expose you to other religions so that you can decide for yourself? If you don't think there's a God, why would you want your child to dabble in anything that would expose them to a philosophy of lies? If you categorically are like, there is no God, there's nothing that created this existence, we're just, a rock floating through space, we all came together somehow, some way, but there's no God that created it. It seems unjust and unkind to then say, but I'm going to expose you every week when we go to our meetings with the Ethical Society every Sunday and have pseudo church where you learn about all these other religions so that you can choose one of those fairy tales to stake all your hopes and dreams on. Do you know what I'm saying? Like that, either you're an atheist or you're not an atheist. Why would you ask your child to try to navigate those really difficult waters? Grown adults can't figure out about religion. Why would you say to your little 8-year-old grandchild, hey, I'm going to tell you about all these religions and then you pick one, although there's not a God. Like I said, they attended pseudo church. She says that the ideal setting to learn love and acceptance was the Ethical Society, according to Marion. So they attended meetings every Sunday. It was unheard of for a Black West Indian family at this time to choose to not go to church. We were supposed to be in some Baptist church somewhere. Not Marion. Status quo was out the door when it came to her truth. I double underline that because I feel like that is the line that lodged itself in Jada's heart, and that's her guiding light. The status quo is out the door when it comes to my truth. So if this is the way social norms would have me behave, I'm not going to do it. Now, look, I'm not opposed to somebody thinking for themselves, making their own decisions. I certainly do in a lot of respects. But just the idea that if it's your truth, you don't have to comply with anything that makes logical sense. I think that that's problematic. Because what is your truth based on? Your truth is a subjective reality. And unfortunately, you are coexisting with real reality. So how do you make those two things jive? That's all I'm saying. She says that grandfather, grandmother, and I would drive together in our yellow Volvo, which both my grandparents considered the safest and most reliable car on the road, and the Ethical Society meetings were held in a modest home not far from us. Where is Mother at this point? Where's Adrienne? She doesn't go to the Ethical Society? We'd entered the home, and we'd see that, as usual, chairs had been set up for a morning lecture with a podium in the middle. We'd sing songs about the winds of change and peace and listen as different speakers talked about bringing humanity together through understanding and love. The children would later move to a smaller room upstairs and learn about different religions practiced in different settings and cultures. This is church without a point. Meetings of the Ethical Society exposed me not just to teachings of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and other faiths, but to the histories and cultures practiced of their followers. It was enchanting to hear about far-off lands and the customs and rituals that expressed the mysterious communion followers found with their understanding of God. She says that through all of this, she did come up with one clear statement, and that is that God is love. She said Jesus could be a path, as could Allah and Buddha. But the fact was that the higher power was going to make itself available according to an individual's soul's needs. It became my lasting view that the higher power, no matter what you call your source, lives within the temple of your heart. What I can say is that she is, to a degree, a little bit more enlightened than grandmother at this point, in the sense that she at least admits that there's a higher power. But this is my problem with all of this, that the higher power is going to conform itself to my needs. Well, then I'm the God. Anyway, regardless, at a young age, though she had not found a religion that was tactile and with any definite edges to it, she at least was agreeing that a higher power was probably likely, because all these other religions acknowledge that there's a higher power. So though grandmother wasn't there yet, Jada at least had decided that much. But it is sad because there was nobody to guide her towards something more specific. She says that at such a young age, she didn't have the language to articulate these beliefs to her grandmother. She knew that her heart and mind were allowed to be open in that place. And grandmother had made the choice to take her there, so it was okay that grandmother didn't believe in the higher power, but she did. The next section is her discussing something we've already talked about, and that's grandmother's background. This is where the book discusses grandmother's paranoid schizophrenic mother who had to be institutionalized, grandmother's traumatic pregnancy at the age of 13, And she says that grandmother never gave the impression that she had been raped. It seemed as if she simply didn't know what was happening, and it was an innocent mistake. The fact that she was so adamant about teaching me at an early age how reproduction works leads me to believe that ignorance was the biggest culprit in her teen pregnancy. It would also explain why she felt compelled to become a sex educator in the school system when it was still taboo. I think it's also interesting that her own daughter, Jada's mother, became pregnant at 17. So she probably felt like it was her moral duty to start telling people how this all works, because she was pregnant at 13, her own daughter was pregnant at 17. Clearly, the youths aren't figuring it out on their own, that they should be a little bit more careful when they're choosing to be with each other in certain ways. I think that all of the hardships that had happened to grandmother made her a very empathetic person and a non-judgmental person, in the sense that you could go and you could tell her all your things. And she was just, like Jada has said so many times, very warm person. She was a person with standards, but that didn't mean she wasn't a warm person. She says, at grandmother's house, within her handmade haven, I saw how familial love could pull you through seemingly impossible times. She says she witnessed the miracles of healing at her grandmother's house for her grown children, each of whom at different stages needed to return to home for a reprieve from the harsh world. She might not always agree with what your choices were, but she still loved them fiercely. And she says that every night of her life, as long as she was living at grandmother's house, ended with her going to bed and hearing her grandmother play Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. And she says she knows that she could never have fallen asleep without hearing it. So that's the end of that chapter. Now, at the very end of the chapter, lo and behold, what should we find but a workbook page. Here's the workbook, what none of us ever asked for. So Jada wants us to journal about the memories that we have, and about beautiful childhood memories that we have, because she says that people spend too much time talking about the hard times of their childhood, and then the negativity gets into your system, and now it's time for you to nourish you because you are so beautiful, and by the way, you're a golden soul. See, even if what she's saying here is partially true, I would agree that we probably do spend too much time talking about the negative things that have impacted us and not enough time on the beautiful things that happened to us. That might be a positive enough exercise. But I resent the fact that this is a biography. This is not a therapy workbook. So I don't need you to tell me this narrative, which I was enjoying to a point, and then suddenly you're like, okay, by the way, where's your journal? Here's some questions. Get that pen out. We need to talk about your childhood memories. So, no, I don't, Jada. So I don't know. This chapter was, but next chapter is called The Blessed Child of Two Addicts. What's that about? I can't wait to get to that chapter. So, I think this was interesting background. It certainly wasn't information I had, but I'm not surprised because I really don't know anything about Jada Pinkett Smith. Only thing I know about her is that she sat her husband down at a red table and humiliated him about her own transgressions. And then, sitting there and being all upset when Will laughed at a joke and then Will got up and slapped someone. I mean, that's pretty much it with what I know. So I didn't know. She grew up in Baltimore. I didn't know any of that kind of stuff. So this will be an interesting trip. This chapter was okay, but I'm looking forward to next time we're together. That'll be really good. All right. See you later. Bye.